All right, so I'm going to describe this a little bit more about what was going on about this time, like 2016. Like I said, my whole life I was a left winger, communist, anti-white. Then in like 2018, or no, my whole life, and then like 2014, I became a right winger, nationalist, pro-white, and then I became in like 2016 back to or like 15, I went back to communist, leftist. Then in like 2016, I went back to right winger. I'm describing a little bit how my grandpa, like I said, I would be looking at the Bible and I would say to my grandpa stuff like, well, look, Jesus said, blessed are the poor. But my grandpa would say, well, that's what it says in one of the Gospels, but in the other Gospel it says, blessed are the poor in spirit. So he's talking about humbleness, like humility. And, my grandpa's saying like, yeah, well, when you're humble, you're not arrogant and you just go all out and therefore you don't settle and you're not content and you just go all out. So it was, and you work hard. And so I always saw him as a right winger, white supremacist, but I'm like, he's sort of moving me more to be a right winger again, right? And I wanted to, when I was a left winger, I wanted to see the Bible as communist. Like, one of the things was, I think, like I said, because when I saw myself as Jewish and I wanted to race mix to white people, and like, one of the things I hated was when people would be like, oh yeah, Jesus hated the Jews and stuff like that, and Jesus said the Jews were the synagogue of Satan, and I would be like, no, he wasn't against the Jews, he was against the Pharisees, because the Pharisees, they wanted the highest seat, and they wanted, they were materialistic, and they were more capitalistic, because I was a communist and I wanted race mixing. So I was like, no, Jesus was just against the capitalists and like the Pharisees, who are more capitalistic and more arrogant and more into money. So that was the way I wanted to see things when I was a communist, leftist, anti-white. But then when I became then I started, like I said, I started to become more of a right winger, and I'll just kind of give examples of a little bit more of this shift that I made. So like my grandpa, like I said, I liked my grandpa's stuff kind of because he seemed to be a little bit anti-religion, but at the same time he was very spiritual and like new agey, which is kind of religious. And I always saw new age people as more white supremacists as well. Like I saw all religion as white supremacists usually. But so my grandpa seemed a little more new agey, but at the same time he seemed a little anti-Christian. And I always liked anti-Christian because I saw, religion as white supremacist. It maintains division. It maintains, the white people nationalism versus the brown people, Muslim, Christian nationalism versus Muslim nationalism. I always thought, I was a communist. I wanted to destroy religion. I wanted everybody to mix. I wanted to defeat the white people. I saw myself as Jewish and I saw white people as bad, right? But the thing is, I was just basically a typical leftist. But then this is what happened though. So my grandpa, he's making me, I liked what he would talk about. So when he seemed a little bit anti-Christian and also a little anti-religion, like I said, my grandpa would say that, he thought that, I asked him, do you think that religion is a mental illness or neurosis, like Freud said? And my grandpa's like, yeah, I do kind of think that, because if you're in the flow, you're not attached to any beliefs. And my grandpa would be like, yeah, and belief in a separate God is magical, dualistic consciousness, and everything is one and everything is energy. So again, it's his very new age. He had this very new age kind of scientific way of looking at things. It's new age mixed with rationalism, scientism, naturalism, right? And he believed, that there was a Big Bang and it was a quantum fluctuation, but he believed that there was like a evolutionary aspect of reality where things would add in complexity. So for instance, like I said, his big thing was like, well, atoms, or quarks turn into atoms, and atoms turn into molecules, and molecules turn into cells, and then cells turn into life. Well, what comes after life? And my grandpa's big thing was, after life is the kingdom of heaven. Now I remember I didn't like that idea because I was like, well, Grandpa, that seems to me like progressive consciousness, like things are progressing, but and it also seems to imply time. But my grandpa was very new age, and he was like, well, there is no time. So I was like, yeah, so it's not what's after life, it's what's already there, what's beyond life. And if you're trying to make it happen, like make happen what comes after life, to me that seems like you're trying to make things happen, but it's already there and you just want to be in the flow. So I was more communist, like just let go, just be in the flow, just let go type of thing. But my grandpa was, my grandpa liked that idea. But so I remember another thing my grandpa would say is, when he would talk about the Bible, he would be like, yes, the laws are concessions to a work in progress. So he would say, until we're in the flow, we need laws, and you need an order to depend on until you're in the flow and you're in oneness consciousness and stuff. Then you don't need laws. And my grandpa would later teach me that's what Jesus meant when he said, like, in the flow, or he fulfilled the law. Because my grandpa would be like, yes, Jesus represents the flow, and in the flow you fulfill the law. You don't need the law. But I was but I remember like when my grandpa said that about progress, I was like, well, Grandpa, progress to me, again, that seems like making things happen. But I said I prefer the word process because, again, progress implies time, and you say that there is no time. And I like process because it's like already there. Like, there is no development. Everything's already happened. There is no thing. And my grandpa was like, oh, that is a good idea. Yeah, it is kind of against the idea of making things happen. But again, I think that my mentality, though, was more communist. I didn't like the idea of progress because in my mind, I'm like, yeah, well, white people want progress and white people try to make progress and they screw things up and they, kill the Native Americans, they kill the black people. And, I was a leftist, communist, anti-white. So that's the way that I was. So that was like, I think of it like a fish. A fish doesn't recognize the water because it's like just such a part of its life. It doesn't even recognize the significance of it. And like me, I didn't, what was really shaping my life so much was I saw myself as Jewish and I was against white people, and I wanted race mixing. That was the way I always was. And especially, to defeat the white people. So, especially the Aryans. But so that's the way that I was. But I said, as I was saying, my grandpa was making me more right wing. But again, my grandpa's teachings, I liked some of them that seemed left wing. So for instance, like, I'll give one example was my grandpa liked the movie by what was that movie called? The Da Vinci Code. And a lot of Christians don't like the Da Vinci Code because they say it's anti-Christian. But my grandpa really liked it. Because my grandpa would be like, he likes stuff where it's kind of like thinking outside the box. Because my grandpa would be like, well, the box is not the flow. The conformity is not the flow. So he'd like things that kind of think outside the box, like the idea that Jesus had children or whatever, or stuff like that. But at the same time, my grandpa would be like, well, it doesn't, all that stuff doesn't matter. What really, Jesus represents the flow. So it doesn't matter if he had children or didn't have children. He just represents the flow. But I liked, but he liked the movie, The Da Vinci Code, and one of the things that my grandpa taught was he would be like, there is no Holy Grail. My grandpa said, the Holy Grail is a container, but there is no container. There is no contained. There is no thing. So the idea that there's a Holy Grail, there is no thing. And my grandpa liked the idea of, or the movie of the Da Vinci Code because he's like, so, I mean, I like that idea because it's like anti-Christian. So it's like, oh, and my grandpa, again, like I said, Dr. Horrod taught that Jesus wasn't God and that, he was one with God because he was, everything is infinite love intelligence, but my grandpa would say everything is energy because he followed Dr. Horrod, but not really. He changed it, made it more materialistic scientism, right? More scientific New Age, but Dr. Horrod was very just New Age. But so my grandpa was like, yeah, everything is energy. So to worship Jesus, no, because everything is one. You are one with Jesus. You are one with everything is one. Everything's energy. And if you worship something outside yourself, that's dualistic, but and that confirms the illusion of the self. So, but anyways, my grandpa would be like, yeah, there is no Holy Grail because that implies dualistic consciousness, a container in something it contains, but there is no thing. And in the flow, you are one with everything, and there is no thing, right? So, I like these ideas because it seemed a little anti-Christian to me, and I'm like, yeah, that's good. And like one of my grandpa's big teachings was the idea of when the disciples go on the mountain of transfiguration, and they say, I want to build booths, and then Jesus says, don't build booths. And I guess they had an experience of God and they wanted to build booths, but my grandpa's like, yes, don't build a booth because a booth is like an encapsulation. And he said, my grandpa would say that there's thinking type of booths where you encapsulate things in thoughts, and then there's action-oriented booths where you encapsulate them in actions, and then there's emotional booths where you encapsulate them in emotions and stuff. But he says when you have awareness of God, just pure awareness, you don't want to encapsulate it. You want it to be an impression. You don't want to contain it. You don't want to solidify it because, and I guess like the idea would be like, then you're making a formula, right? But when you're in the flow, there is no formula. So you're just, one with everything. So I think of it like basketball. Like if you start thinking, okay, I have to shoot this way, then you've created a booth, you created a formula, or you created an encapsulation. But when you're in the flow, not even thinking. You're in pure awareness. You lost yourself. You're outside yourself. But regardless, my grandpa's. So I like those ideas. I'm like, okay, yeah. It seems very Buddhist. It seems anti-Christian, and so my grandpa, and it's like the idea, my grandpa would kind of be like, yeah, if Christians say they believe in Jesus and stuff, that's dualistic consciousness because they believe that there's a separate Jesus and that they're not one with everything, and that because Jesus just believed he was one with everything, and that's why he said that he was God because everything is one and there is no thing. So I'm like, yeah, I like these ideas because they're anti-Christian and that's anti-white and anti-religion, and I want to race mix the white people. So I like my grandpa's ideas when he's talking about all that stuff. But, so I'm like, okay, those are some good ideas, Grandpa. And then like, also like we watched the Da Vinci Code and my grandpa talked to me about that guy who would whip himself. My grandpa would be like, yeah, that's the problem of religiosity is he thinks that by hurting himself and degrading himself, he's going to go to heaven. But that's still self-confirmatory. He's still focusing on the self. He hasn't transcended the self. I mean, there's a higher aspiration behind it. Yes, he wants to transcend the self, and by whipping himself, that represents that. But my grandpa was like, but if you can't transcend the self with the self, and he's still focused on the self, and he still hasn't stuck in a narrow consciousness, and he's still focusing on trying to save the self, where Jesus says, he who's willing to lose his life for my sake shall find it. And my grandpa would be like, his Jesus' sake is the flow. So the idea is you want to lose the self, and there's no formula for that. But the guy who's whipping himself and trying to kill the people who have the secret of the that Jesus had children and stuff, my grandpa's like, yeah, that's dualistic software. And in the flow, you're not focused on the self. But I'm thinking like, okay, well, that's good. So the Christians, they have insider outsider software, right, grandpa? And my grandpa like, yeah, because they believe in that self-confirmatory, they believe that they have the truth, and they exclude outsiders and stuff like that. But my grandpa would be like, but that's insider outsider software because that's self-confirmatory. But there is no self, and the Christians have beliefs, but if you're in the flow, you don't believe anything. You're just open to inspiration. So I'm like, okay, this is good. I like this stuff because I'm thinking, but the irony is I encapsulated this, or I incorporated this into my dualistic framework that I was utilizing. I won't say my dualistic software, because my grandpa would be like, well, don't personalize it because there is no you. But the software that I was utilizing of, insider, outsider, or I had the dualistic software and predator-prey software toward white people. So I'm like, okay, I like these ideas because they're anti-Christian, and that's anti-white, and that's going to increase race mixing. So when I wrote my books, my based on true story books, when I was a leftist, I would write those ideas and try to kind of degrade Christianity and try to degrade religion. Like another example was, my grandpa would be like, ask my grandpa about, I heard that a Muslim guy say that, someone could be bad and he can still be saved by Allah. Allah can choose who he can save. And then someone could be good his whole life and he might not be saved. My grandpa's like, yeah, that's the idea of the flow. Allah represents the flow. And if you're, you can be good, but you could still not transcend the self. But you could be bad and you could even transcend the self. And there's no formula for the flow. And again, I like these ideas because I'm like, okay, so being bad can be good. And I always saw the white people as good, right? As supposed to be more conformist and good and upholding the system. And I was a Marxist. I was a communist. I wanted to destroy the system. And I'd like to see the black people, with their gangster rap and the degrading stuff and the sexual stuff, because I'm like, oh yeah, being bad can be good. That can get them in the flow more. As my grandpa would say, like, they can get a higher level of aliveness by doing that, and they can lose themselves. So I wanted to make the good bad and the bad good. So I was a very much communist, leftist, anti-white. So, but I didn't, I was utilizing dualistic software, and I didn't really recognize that so much because, like I said, when you're a fish in the water, you don't recognize the water. Like, it was so much a part of me, I couldn't even recognize it. It's kind of crazy, but so, but I like my grandpa's ideas that seemed a little anti-religion. Like another example would be, we watched the movie Fiddler on the Roof, probably in like 2014 or whatever, and my grandpa's like, yes, the person in the Fiddler on the Roof, he's not religious. And my grandpa would look at the people in Fiddler on the Roof. Like, there's this one scene where the woman's like wafting the smoke in her face and stuff, and she's like, la, la, la. My grandpa's like, yes, that's sentimentality and emotionality. My grandpa would be like, yeah, sentimentality and emotionality. He later would teach me. It took me a while for me to understand this, but he later taught me. It took me a long time because he didn't teach me very well. He confused me mostly, but later he would teach me about how, like, sentimentality, I'd ask him about, like, what's wrong with sentimentality, and he would tell me, like, well, sentimentality and emotionality, that's self-confirmatory, because you're like, oh, I'm religious, and my grandpa would make fun of, like, the religious people in the, like, some of the rock music or the concerts, like the religious things where, or I don't know, like Billy Graham or like those types of people when they would be singing and stuff, and he would be like, yes, it's emotionalism and sentimentalism, where they want to be saved and they want to save themselves, but my grandpa's like, that's self-confirmatory, and they still haven't transcended the selves. They're still in emotionalism and sentimentalism. And I like that. So I'm like, yeah, destroy Christianity, destroy religion, and destroy the white people. Yeah. So I liked my grandpa's ideas like that, right? But I didn't realize, that was self-confirmatory on my part. I thought this was me transcending stuff. Like, yeah, let's have open borders and but because I was still identified as Jewish and I wanted to defeat the white people. So I didn't, it's kind of crazy, but that's the way that I saw things. And I always tried to hide that, But my grandpa would be like, yeah, in the movie The Fiddler on the Roof, there's the religious people who are very sentimentalist and emotionalism. But then there's the, there's the other guy who was like a communist, but my grandpa's like, that's not the flow either. So I was always a communist. So, but then I'm thinking like, oh, so that's not the flow, okay? Because communism, now I recognize, because I mean, when I was a communist, it wasn't the flow. I was trying to destroy the white people and stuff, right? And I had an agenda. But my grandpa's like, that's not the flow either. But my grandpa would be like, the filler on the roof, that's the flow. And the flow is when you go all out and you're on the roof and you're not in your comfort zone or your safety net, and you're just going all out, and that's when you play the best music, when you're not in your comfort zone. And I'm like, to me, that seems kind of right wing, but and going all out, like motivational and stuff. But I always saw my grandpa, like, well, later I would kind of get the insight when I listened to an audiobook. My grandpa was, he's very much like a human potential type of guy, right? Like, be in the now, be in the flow. But the idea was, my grandpa thought the movie was very profound, The Fiddler on the Roof, because the fiddler, he is the way to be. He's the one who's in creativity and in synergy and in line with the nature of the universe, which is, creativity and synergy and, and not self-confirmatory, but transcending the self. So, but when I would hear this stuff, I would be like, okay, well, this is anti-religion. And I didn't like religion, remember, because I thought I was white supremacist. So, when I watched Fiddler on the Roof, my grandpa likes it. I'm like, okay, so this is against Orthodox Judaism. And I had, when I was a right-winger, I was kind of into Orthodox Judaism. But then my grandpa's saying like, no, that's not the flow. So then I started going away from that, and I started to become a left-winger again. So that was when I was a left-winger again. So I started writing about that in my Based on True Story books when I was a left-winger and trying to make people into left-wingers. And anti-religion, when I was a left-wing, anti-religion, communist, anti-white person, right? But then, this is what kind of happened that shifted me back to being a right-winger, this was a big one. When I went to Chabad, and the Chabad guy, the Chabad rabbi, invited my grandpa to come, because I told him about my grandpa was like a philosopher and stuff, and he was like, well, invite your grandpa to come to one of the Chabad things. And my grandpa's not Jewish, but so I was like, okay, so I invited my grandpa. And then we had dinner there, and my grandpa, like, we did the prayers where we, read the books out loud, and we did all the stuff. And my grandpa was like, and also like, well, at one point my grandpa reached out his hand to shake the rabbi's wife's hand, and the rabbi's wife was like, no, we don't do that. And my grandpa was like, oh, you don't do that? And when that happened, in my mind, I was like, yeah, they're backwards. They're the white supremacists, Orthodox Jews are white supremacists. They're like typical religious people. They want to subjugate women to. And I always saw like those types of people just wanting to maintain their race and just white supremacists, right? But then afterwards, my grandpa was like, no, that was very great. I love the Chabad. Like, they're very. And the other thing that happened was I told my grandpa how some of the Chabad people would talk about like the Federal Reserve, and some of the Jews who want to like race mix type of stuff, but not necessarily that, but the Jews who were corrupt, right? And then my grandpa was like, well, there might be some insight involved with that. It might not just be judgmental, but it might be discernment on their part. So my grandpa would make a distinction between judgment and discernment. And judgment was when it's emotional and it's not true, but discernment would be recognition of the truth, which now I understand, but at that time I didn't understand. But I always hated people who were like, oh, the Federal Reserve and the Jews are, the bad guys and stuff like that, because I was like, oh man, they're the evil ones, they're the white supremacists. But I was one of the Jews that they would hate because I wanted race mixing in it, and I had that predatory mentality. I was like what David Icke would see as a reptilians, right? I was against the white people, and I feel like David Icke was always a white supremacist. I didn't like him because of that. But now I recognize, like, well, if I was David Icke I would be the same way. Like, I would be against Jews who want race mixing and want to destroy my race and stuff. So now I understand that, but at that time I didn't have the insight to really see it, right? But, basically though, like, I liked my grandpa's, when I was a communist, I liked his stuff that seemed anti-religion and anti-Judaism and anti-Christianity, and, it's sentimentalism, emotionalism. But then my grandpa told me, no, I like this Chabad place. These people, the rituals were very profound, and those rituals can help you get in the flow. And I was like, well, what about when you're not allowed to touch the rabbi's wife? My grandpa's like, well, that could be a beneficial ritual. It can keep you out of, some of these laws and orders can protect people from their immaturity. But my grandpa, at the same time, he'd be like, you don't need it. Like, separating the men and the women, the Chabad does that. He'd be like, you don't need it. But at the same time, if they're doing it as a ritual discipline to protect people from, self-confirmatory behavior, such as, sexual behavior or whatever, it could be beneficial. If you're not in the flow, rituals and rules and regulations can, they're a concession. So this is moving me back to being right-winger again. So my grandpa's teaching me this stuff. I'm like, then I'm moving. I was a communist, anti-religion, and I started being like, oh, so my grandpa's for religion. So then I went back to being more right-wing, nationalist, right wing pro white. So like this was in 2016. So I moved back to being a right winger. And then that was all the way till like 2020, 2019, 2020. I was a right winger, and I'll get more into that.